Mankind has always looked to the stars. Since time immemorial, the universe has been a source of fascination and fundamental questions. What else is out there? How was all this created? Where do we come from? It is perhaps the greatest adventure a human being can ever experience, floating weightlessly in nothingness and looking back to the Earth from outer space. Astronaut, a dream job, star voyager. And the first human being to set foot on Mars may well have already been born. Welcome to Spacetime with Ulrich Walter, astronaut and scientist. He knows, in space, incredible things are in store for us. The launch of a Soyuz rocket from the Russian spaceport Baikonur. The crew's destination is the International Space Station. But the road to becoming an astronaut is long and extremely hard. There are thousands of applicants, but only a handful will be selected. And even they are only at the beginning. It's the start of years of training with no guarantee of ever flying into space. Those who eventually do get into space then belong to a small but very exclusive circle.
God knows the job of an astronaut isn't part-time, it's full-time, and it stays with you for life. And if you think the selection process is tough, think again. The selection process is unbelievably tough. And only after that does the actual training begin, roughly 5 years, and that too is extremely hard. And at the end, there's still no guarantee you will ever actually fly.
Being an astronaut, a star voyager, is the dream of children and adults alike. A dream that can come true. Man is aiming to return to the moon. He wants to explore Mars, and the training for these new explorers is already underway.
Be positive. Otherwise, there's no need to even think about starting. The whole thing is a lengthy business and an attitude toward life.
Being an astronaut isn't just a profession, it's a calling, and one that requires a well-founded scientific background, the ability to work in a team, and good fortune. After all, competition is fierce.
I was very small, in primary school perhaps, when I started saying that I wanted to go into space.
The Space Shuttle program was intended to fulfill a dream for America. The Earth-to-orbit space transportation system was going to make manned space travel routine. Carrying up to 7 astronauts, the shuttle transported a payload of several tons of freight, mainly to the International Space Station, where a 6-man crew live and work, constantly orbiting the Earth. The ISS is the scientific outpost for mankind in space.
I knew this was exactly my thing. It involves science, technology within the framework of what's feasible, working in international teams, and of course, that little touch of adventure.
Matthias Maurer is one of the current cores of European astronauts. A full-blooded scientist, he now has to go back to school if he's to fulfill his dream, traveling into space.
Being an astronaut at all costs, otherwise my life wouldn't be fulfilled, wasn't something I constantly had in the back of my mind. I had a good job here, and that's what convinced me. I enjoyed every single day, and then when the offer of being an astronaut actually came, I was all the happier.
The nomination to join an astronaut class is followed by several years of hard training. After a year of basic training, the future space travelers learn everything about their new workplace, the International Space Station. They acquire extensive knowledge of the station's individual modules, the technical systems on board, transport spacecraft and rockets. but it can be many years before they actually get to apply this knowledge.
At the time of the selection and the announcement, immediately being able to talk to so many astronauts and being congratulated by them as well to say, oh, welcome to the club, and we hope that you can fly soon and whatever. And of course, at that moment, I still had the hope that I would fly very soon. Then it took still 12, 13 years before I flew to space, but nevertheless, it was still a great journey.
Frank de Winne flew to the International Space Station twice. His second mission in space lasted 188 days, half a year. And de Winne took up the post of Space Station Commander.
When did I find out I was going to be an astronaut? The selection process finished at the end of March 1987, and after that, I heard nothing more from the DLR. Then, in July 1987, I received a phone call in my office. Herr Walter, do you think you could manage to travel to Germany? Yes, I think I could. So I booked a flight and almost missed the plane. 5 minutes later, and I wouldn't be standing here now. Then, on August 6th, 1987, a press conference. 5 candidate astronauts faced the press together with the then research minister, Riesenhuber, who then said, "May I introduce to you the 5 new astronauts?" Okay, that's when I knew I was in.
Opportunities for space flights are very limited. Only 6 people can work on the space station at any one time. On average, they stay in space for 6 months. Only 3 times have European astronaut classes been put together.
In autumn 1985, I came back to the squadron after a flight, and my operations officer said, "You've got to report to the commander." I, of course, immediately thought, oh, has something gone wrong? But then he asked me if I was interested in taking part in an astronaut selection process. And I didn't have to think twice about the answer.
After nomination as an astronaut, the journey into weightlessness and the infinite nothingness of space is already within reach and almost a certainty. Waiting in orbit is your workplace, the space station. Once you are selected, you've left thousands of other candidates behind. It's a bit like playing in a lottery and winning the top prize.
Of course, you're happy when you get that call telling you that you've done it. No question. Especially all the tension that builds up. It's a long process, an entire year. Tension builds up over that time, especially in the final phase. A lot of tension, and that's just suddenly released.
In 2008, the European Space Agency, ESA, invited people to take part in a selection process. 8,500 candidates sent their applications. ESA then selected the grand total of 6 candidates. Among them was one woman, Samantha Cristoforetti.
There are far more people capable of being astronauts than there are places for trips into space. And that's why you can't really plan anything. So I can only say to anyone who's really crazy about space travel, stay that way. But definitely have a plan B, so that you don't get to the end of your life and have to say, I've missed something here. I've got all the knowledge, all the skills, but ESA didn't take me because, unfortunately, they didn't have enough flights. So keep your enthusiasm, definitely. And if the chance arises, grab it. But don't plan your life into a one-way street.
The Space Shuttle program led to a noticeable increase in the number of US astronauts. In the heyday of the shuttle era, NASA nominated new astronaut classes averaging 20 pilots and mission specialists every 2 years. And on board the shuttle, there were also places for astronauts from other nations. Over several missions, the shuttle carried Europe's space laboratory Space Lab into orbit, opening the door for Europe to manned space travel.
When I saw the space shuttle fly for the first time, it was my first year in university studying as an engineer and pilot. I knew that this is really something that I would like to do in the future as well.
The only places currently available in space are on board the International Space Station. 6 crew members live permanently on the space station, remaining there for approximately 6 months before the next team arrives. But before anyone has the opportunity to work in infinity, they first have to survive the application process.
The first stage was based on my application. There were 8,500 applicants altogether, and about 1,000 of them were invited to Hamburg. This was one day spent doing lots of very long computer-based tests. Basic math, physics, mechanics, English, and spatial awareness skills. But also lots of psychological tests, because that's very important if you're working as an astronaut in space over long periods.
Besides the basic knowledge, an applicant also has to demonstrate a quite diverse range of skills. Space travel is teamwork and also public relations.
Stage 2 was then very strongly based on psychological abilities. So working in teams was very important. We did role plays and had lots of conversations with psychologists to see if you have the right kind of character, or if there were any, let's say, unresolved issues from your past that might rule out your suitability as an astronaut. It's a real interrogation.
The future space traveler is also a representative of their nation. Once they've been nominated, their lives are very much in the public eye. And they've also just successfully completed one of the world's most testing job application procedures. What's required is a person with a balanced personality and a lot of staying power.
The tests are just so hard that you never get to the end of the level, or that you never can complete the tests. And then, of course, a very tough point is as well the medical selection, because also there, okay, you know that you're in good health in general, but you never know if your health is good enough to become an astronaut.
He was the first, Yuri Gagarin, the man who was assigned a genuine suicide mission. At that time, the Cold War was to be fought in space, a race between the USA and the Soviet Union. Yuri Gagarin was then 27 years old and a fighter pilot in the Soviet Air Force before he was chosen to be a cosmonaut. On April the 12th, 1961, a Vostok rocket was launched from the Tyuratam Cosmodrome, known as Baikonur today, and took the first human being into space. Yuri Gagarin was pressed into his seat by acceleration forces 5 times the Earth's gravitational pull. The flight lasted 108 minutes and orbited the Earth 8 times. Before him, no one had ever seen our planet from the cosmos. The first American astronauts were also members of the armed forces. From their 110 best test pilots, the USA chose their first 7 astronauts. These first 7 NASA astronauts had to undergo extensive medical examinations and tests. For the doctors too, space and its inherent weightlessness was unknown territory. Everyone was more than a little nervous. The selected fighter and test pilots endured the procedures calmly. They were used to pushing themselves and their machines to the limits of their resilience, and even a little beyond.
When we did the first space flights, we did not know at all what to expect. It was really opening of a totally new domain. We had not been there. We would not know, will people be able to breathe there, to eat there, to live there? So everything was extremely new. And of course, they selected at that time test pilots who were used to do things in this extreme environments, to test new possibilities, to fly with aircraft beyond the speed of sound, which has also never had been done before. So this is why they chose those type of people.
Though the Americans now had suitable astronauts, they were still lagging behind in the technical development of a suitable rocket. Over a third of all American rocket tests failed at that time. The rockets with which the newly founded NASA wanted to send people into space were based on those developed for military purposes. But instead of carrying atomic warheads, they were now to transport astronauts. The first US astronauts, however, didn't take these failures as seriously as the public did. As test pilots, setbacks in the development of new aircraft were a routine part of their lives, and they were more than willing to take certain risks.
Meanwhile, a lot of things have changed. Today, we need scientists because we do scientific work in space. There are a total of 4 laboratories on the space station. And the scientists also need to be engineers because they have to carry out maintenance work on the station, and maybe even repairs. And to do so, they require certain soft skills, like the capacity for teamwork, as they have to work in a team of 6 people. They need loyalty, personal integrity, but also a certain public presence.
The International Space Station is a high-technology structure, and there are ISS replicas in many different locations. The prospective astronauts have to learn about the station's every component, and they have to operate all the station's systems and, of course, be able to remedy malfunctions. And a large proportion of their training deals with emergency plans.
During this basic training, I learn how a space station works, how a rocket works, what experiments we do in space, how do I work on board the station, how do I work outside the station in the big spacesuit.
Survival training is also part of the basics. The crews return to Earth in Soyuz capsules, and if the capsule misses its designated landing position, it could take days for the rescue teams to find it. Diving courses prepare the astronauts for working in weightlessness. In an underwater station, space missions are simulated, living in cramped spaces and working under extreme conditions. And to strengthen teamwork, a little caving may also be on the schedule.
Training does have its challenges, of course, like the survival training I went through in Sweden, sea survival training in Rostock. These are challenges that take you to the very limits of your physical capabilities. But you get through it if you put your heart and soul into it.
And classes, again and again. Theoretical and practical training on ISS modules and the station's functions. During training, private life shrinks to a bare minimum.
We have pass-through cable for the body station. We just have it installed in
After being selected as an astronaut, a very special time begins: studying. It's almost like being a student at university. You're instructed in all the fundamentals of space travel, and regardless of any actual mission, this so-called basic training takes around 2 years. You have the best people, the best lecturers who tell you exactly how the aerospace industry works, what science can actually be done in space. How is it done? It concerns biology, material sciences, general physics, all very interesting subjects for scientists. At that time, I got to know the broad spectrum of science. But it also deals with very concrete issues. For instance, how does a rocket fly in space? What's its trajectory? Relatively complicated, but you learn all that. And then you have to get your pilot's license. So you go to an airfield and learn to fly a Cessna, because you need the pilot's license later to fly a Boeing 737, just like we learned to do. It's all about team training, meaning if a critical situation arises, do I react the right way with my co-pilot? That's why astronauts have to be able to fly. And right at the end, there's the diving training. Why do astronauts learn to dive? After all, they're in space and not underwater. Well, the reason is that later they have to do so-called EVA training. That's extravehicular activity. In other words, spacewalks. Although it has nothing to do with a pleasant stroll. In reality, it's a space mission to repair the space station, for example. And because that has to be trained underwater, they have to get their diver's certificate first. It all belongs to their basic training, and this huge water tank is where the EVA training is actually carried out.
Only underwater can permanent weightlessness be simulated on Earth. Most importantly for the astronauts, securing themselves has to become second nature. Tools and components also have to be secured. In space, the slightest nudge and the parts can disappear into infinity. And so can astronauts. On the timetable now is Russian, the second official language on board the ISS. As the astronauts are launched into space using a Russian spacecraft, part of their training takes place in Star City near Moscow. In Russian, of course.
For me, it was extremely hard to learn Russian. I'm very good in math. I'm an engineer. I like to do calculus. I was really very bad in languages. And so it's a little bit the fate of my career, I would say. I'm Flemish from birth, but to become a military officer in the Belgian Air Force, I had to study French. Otherwise, you cannot become an officer in the Belgian Air Force. Then to become a pilot, I had to study English, and then to become an astronaut, I had to study Russian. So although I don't like languages at all, I ended up having to be proficient in 4 different languages because of the goal that I had for myself and the dream that I wanted to pursue.
For many, learning Russian is the most challenging part of the training. Very hard work.
You've been chosen to be an astronaut. You've actually made it. One of the first questions is, how much do I earn? Well, you have to know all astronauts are public service employees, whether they're Russians, Europeans, or Americans. Let's start with the Americans. Most of them come from the Air Force, so they're paid like soldiers, are then transferred to NASA, earn exactly the same, and then, at 50 or 60, when their work at NASA is over, they go back to the Air Force. So they don't earn very much. It's much the same for the Russians. They too are usually soldiers, but they get a bonus if their mission on board the ISS was successful. And consequently, the Russians put a lot of effort into their space station missions. The Europeans are in a league of their own. Take the Germans, for instance. When I became an astronaut in 1987, I was paid as a civil servant. That pay scale today would be TVL 14, the equivalent of what scientists in Germany's public service earn today, which is around 70,000 euros. So when people say space travel is expensive, it's certainly not because of the money astronauts earn. ESA astronauts are in a completely different class, as they are in European service, and that has 2 advantages. First of all, their salaries are a little higher. And most importantly, in European service, you pay no taxes, and that makes a huge difference.
Another hurdle prospective astronauts have to negotiate lies in Cologne. NVHAB is the name of the Institute for Aerospace Medicine, and it carries out research into the effects of space travel on the human body. This is where future space travelers are screened thoroughly.
We examine the candidates here for 5 days, morning till evening. We look into every available and unavailable orifice to make sure there are no predispositions or precursor stages for illnesses, and of course, no actual illnesses themselves. And as far as possible, we want to rule out the occurrence of any serious illnesses during the next few years of their professional lives.
The researchers are very thorough. They hope to exclude potential risks in advance.
We ask the candidates whether their parents are still alive, of course, how things are with siblings. If they are no longer alive, what was the cause of death? Was it a heart attack? Or are there any hereditary patterns of certain kinds of tumors in the family? Then there is, of course, a higher probability of this person contracting this particular condition.
Humans want to go to Mars, a journey of several years through weightlessness. The basic medical research for this journey is also being conducted at the Institute for Aerospace Medicine's NVHAB laboratory.
Personally, what sticks in my mind as being the most strenuous activity was the week of medical tests. Quite simply because you were taken apart, put back together again, always in the hands of some specialist or other, taking blood samples and doing all sorts of other things to you.
All astronauts returning from space are also examined here to check the general state of their health and any physical changes. Research for a life in space.
As an astronaut, of course, we are very much aware that our health, or being in good health, is part of our profession. If we are not in good health, we will not fly to space. But that does not mean that we necessarily adapt our lifestyle. I still play football from time to time, or at least I did when I was younger, now a little bit less. Of course, but you eat healthy, you try to do a little bit of sports. So yes, you kind of make sure that you're in a good health.
Staying in good condition is the duty of every active astronaut, Samantha Cristoforetti included. The Italian is only the second European woman to fly into space.
It was thought that women wouldn't be able to endure it. And secondly, their menstruation cycles would make them completely unsuitable. Luckily, opinions have changed, and many women have proven that they can cope with everything in space as well as anyone else.
Samantha Cristoforetti is a trained fighter jet pilot in the Italian Air Force. The first woman in space was the Russian Valentina Tereshkova in 1963. But even today, there are far more male than female astronauts.
Why are there so few female astronauts? This question is asked over and over again, yet there is a simple answer. There's only one reason, and that is because so few women actually apply. Let's take a concrete example. The last ESA selection process in 2008. At that time, 8,400 people applied. 17% of them were women. In the end, 6 were selected, including 1 woman. Again, 17%.
The initiative Die Astronautin, the female astronaut, wants to send the first German woman into space. From over 400 applicants, 2 future astronauts have been selected: the meteorologist Insa Eich and the fighter pilot Nicola Baumann. Maybe a dream is about to come true here.
I've always wanted to be an astronaut since I was very small. I always wanted to be a pilot as well. After my pilot training, I studied mechanical engineering for 6 years, mainly with a view to applying as an astronaut. Because all astronauts need an engineering degree, a scientific qualification, some sort of training in this field. And I just started putting my application together when I got the call about the Female Astronaut campaign.
One of these 2 is to be sent to the International Space Station soon. The decision on who will go and who will continue to be available as backup will only be taken shortly before the mission.
The last 13 years in the German army have demonstrated to me very clearly what it's like to be one of the few women in a technical profession in a male domain. But of course, I also know that it's no problem at all, that everyone who performs well and is a good member of the team is fully accepted.
Nicola Baumann is Air Force officer. She flies Eurofighters and is responsible for airspace surveillance over Germany and other NATO states.
If I were to image how my professional journey would ideally go, then my first flight would be to the ISS for 14 days. There I'd prove I can be a valuable member to the team and find my place on the ISS. And then I would love to take part in a long-term space mission, far beyond the ISS, perhaps to the Moon, to Mars, to the end of the solar system, or preferably even much further.
Nicola Baumann and her colleague Insa Thiele Eich are receiving 2 years of basic training to become astronauts. The German Aerospace Center supported the selection process and carried out the psychological and medical aptitude tests.
One thing needs to be made very clear. The demands for the selection of these 2 female astronauts were exactly the same as those used for international selection procedures, for instance by the ESA. On the other hand, it's a private initiative, which means you have to find all the funding yourself. This includes, for example, the 200,000 euros for training. They hope to raise this through crowdfunding. But that's only a very small part. The biggest chunk is the 40 million euros for the flight, and they hope to raise that through sponsorship.
Once a future astronaut has been assigned to a flight into space, that's when mission training starts. And this takes place at a number of locations all over the world. The space travelers are trained for their particular tasks during the mission. They work on the experiments they'll have to carry out later in space, and they train together with their crews. The Russian ISS training module is in Star City near Moscow. This is where the future space station residents get to know the Russian section of the station and are introduced to their spacecraft, the Soyuz. Survival training is on the schedule once again. Should the Soyuz capsule miss its designated landing position, it could be days before the crew is found. So they must be able to survive in snow-covered Siberia as well as in the desert. The capsule could just as easily come down in the ocean. All these scenarios are trained and practiced. Every emergency situation imaginable is simulated. The astronauts should be prepared for absolutely every possibility, including the impossible.
3 years of mission-specific training is very, very long. And you do much more traveling. You fly to Houston, you fly to Moscow for Soyuz training. You see less and less of your family. But there's one thing you know for sure. It won't leave without me. And then there's one other thing. You have to be sure that later, on board the space station or the shuttle, you get everything right. To make sure of this, every astronaut has a little notebook about this size, where they note all the details they might forget. Like, where's my food on day whatever of the mission? Things like that, for example. Or where do I find my clothes on day 10 of the mission? So then you write down, yes, in this locker or in this drawer I can find this or that. By the time you've finished, you have a little memo book with absolutely everything in it, even including how do I operate the toilet. And if anyone is interested in seeing what my notebook for my mission was like, just go to the Deutsche Museum, where it's now on public display.
Mission training for a new International Space Station crew goes on for 18 months, culminating in a 2-day final exam on the systems of the Soyuz spaceship. Just before the launch, there are the final medical examinations. The rocket launch itself is also simulated in a centrifuge. But what you actually do and how you really react in the event of an emergency can't be simulated beforehand.
It's very difficult to prepare to say if something would really very badly happen and one of your colleagues would pass away in orbit. It's very difficult to see how people would react to that. But that does not mean that we don't talk about it. That does not mean that during certain simulations, for example, we simulate that one of the colleagues gets an electroshock and you try to do reanimation. How would you do that on orbit? What are the equipment that you have on board of the ISS to use it? But some of the simulations also end that it was not possible. And already in the simulations, it's quite difficult to come to that level and say, okay, now I need to stop because there is nothing more that I can do. How you would react in reality, I think, is very difficult to predict.
Space travel is generally a dangerous business, not just the ride into space on a rocket. Even on the space station, crews are exposed to constant dangers. Space debris, for instance, poses a threat to the station and its residents. Impacts are regularly recorded. Such a hit can trigger a catastrophe.
About a month before my mission, I received a letter from NASA. About 5 pages of forms had to be filled in. Herr Walter, in the event of your death, what should NASA do? And then you have to describe precisely how you would like to be buried. What should we do about your family? And of course, that gets you thinking, because you realize something could actually happen, and I have to prepare myself and my family for that eventuality.
January the 28th, 1986. From Launch Pad 39B in Cape Canaveral, Florida, the Challenger space shuttle takes off. It's the 25th mission of an American space transporter. The launch looks routine, but after 73 seconds, NASA's world changes forever.
Roger, roll, Challenger. Challenger now heading downrange. Preparing to re-throttle the engines back up to 100%. Challenger, go at throttle up. Challenger, go at throttle up.
Challenger explodes in a huge fireball. All 7 astronauts burn to death, including a teacher invited onto the flight by NASA, whose parents were watching the launch from the ground. It was the greatest catastrophe in the history of manned spaceflight. The very first time NASA had lost astronauts during a mission. For 2.5 years, all shuttle flights were suspended. The teacher who lost her life along with the NASA astronauts, Krista McAuliffe, was part of the Teacher in Space project. She was to give lessons to her class from outer space and was chosen from among 11,000 applicants. February the 1st, 2003, the space shuttle Columbia burns up on re-entering the Earth's atmosphere. Once again, all 7 crew members die, 6 American and 1 Israeli astronaut. In 2011, the shuttle program was finally discontinued. Since then, US astronauts too have flown into space on Russian rockets from the Baikonur spaceport. And even in Baikonur, every goodbye could be the last.
Well, there are a lot of traditions. The Russians believe in keeping up their rituals and always doing them exactly the same way. It's the last time you have any real contact to your families. It's a kind of toast. They have their champagne, the astronauts have their fruit juice, and everyone says something, and it's really the last time you have any direct contact.
The current Soyuz rocket is in principle the same type that took Yuri Gagarin into space. Robust technology. At the top it carries the capsule for the crew, below it a rescue system. Solid propellant rockets designed to catapult the crew to safety in the event of an emergency.
Your family is arriving 3 days before the launch. You have meetings with them. You have certain events with them. Even the day of the launch itself, you still see your family in the room where you slept for a final farewell for a couple of minutes. Then you're traveling with the bus. Then you still see them behind the glass when you are in the processing facility. So there is all kinds of these events that are happening throughout the launch date. So it's not like you say goodbye once. You kind of say goodbye 5 or 6 times. And at the end of this whole process, you're actually happy that you don't have to say goodbye anymore, but that finally you can go and that you're ready to step into the rocket and fly to space.
There's one final opportunity to say goodbye when the astronauts board the rocket. A wave for the cameras and their families. Though Soyuz is regarded as very reliable, even rockets of this type have exploded on the launch pad.
Fear is a very bad advisor. Of course, there is tension. You have adrenaline flowing through your body, but that's good, actually, because adrenaline means that you are more concentrated, you think faster, you can react faster, you're more alert, you can stay awake longer. So this is actually a good effect of the tension that you have. If this would turn into fear, then of course it becomes bad, because then you do erratic things, you can't think straight anymore, you make mistakes. So I don't know of any astronauts actually who have fear, but I think that all the astronauts have a lot of tension when they step in the rocket.
The rocket's fuel tanks are filled with several hundred tons of kerosene and oxygen, a highly explosive mix.
Along with the question, did the mission change you? Astronauts are most frequently asked, were you afraid during the launch? But no, astronauts are not afraid during the launch, simply because they knew they would be getting into this rocket from the moment they made their application. On top of that, during your 5 years of training, you're placed in such situations every day, and you know, okay, something can happen, but you learn ways to get out of such situations. That takes away the fear. But there are, of course, worries, no question. Every astronaut knows that the chances of losing their lives during a launch are 1 in 100. But it's a similar situation to you getting into your car in the morning. You know that there are 3,000 deaths on Germany's roads every year. And although you know that, you're not afraid to get into your car. What remains is simply the worry that something might happen to you.
The return of a Soyuz capsule to Earth is an adventure all of its own. The spacecraft is retrieved by gravity. It falls through the atmosphere towards the ground, generating temperatures of over 1,000 degrees Celsius. If the angle of entry is wrong, the capsule is either catapulted back into space or it burns up. In the final phase, parachutes are deployed to slow the capsule's rate of descent. The landing zone for Russian capsules is in the open plains of Kazakhstan. Rescue teams monitor the descent and help the crew out of the capsule after their hellish ride back to Earth. Re-entry and landing are among the most difficult maneuvers in manned space travel. Nevertheless, given half a chance, there isn't a single astronaut that wouldn't go back into space right away.
Technically, there's no reason why someone shouldn't go into space a second or third time. The number of flights is, of course, limited, and it's understandable that everyone would like to have another mission as soon as possible. To say there was competition might be putting it too strongly, but everyone really loves the job, and so everyone wants to be on the next flight.
Back on Earth, the astronauts have to get reaccustomed to the planet's gravity. Their time in space has weakened them, so they first have to go through several weeks of rehabilitation before they can take on any new tasks.
Once you've been in space, you just want to go back again, that's for sure. I don't know anyone who would see it differently.
Floating weightlessly above our home planet, experiencing it in all its beauty, has a deep effect on people.
It has changed your perception to certain things. For me, the biggest perception, for example, is that, well, we live all here on a planet, and looking from above, there are no borders. Borders are imaginary lines that we as humans have drawn on a map. But in reality, of course, they do not exist. Nevertheless, over those imaginary lines, we start fighting and we start killing each other. So it brings you very much aware of this fact that we are just living on one small planet in this immense universe that is also extremely vulnerable.
Discovery on at the 180.
The Americans finally retired the space shuttle in 2011. Though it had opened the door to a new dimension in manned spaceflight, the shuttle nevertheless proved to be a dead end.
It's currently 3,500.
The system was too complex, too prone to technical problems, and the flights into orbit were too expensive. NASA had trained hundreds of astronauts for the shuttle program, and after the final shuttle mission, they too were surplus to requirements.
Main gear touchdown. Pilot Jim Denton now deploying the drag chute.
The careers of space travelers after their missions can take very different courses. Let's take the Americans first. After their first or second mission, lots of astronauts leave NASA because they get very good offers from industry, especially the aerospace industry. This is because there are aerospace companies constructing spacecraft, and to do so, they need experienced astronauts to tell them what to pay attention to. I'd say only about a third of astronauts remain at NASA for their entire professional lives. At the ESA, things are completely different. Once you're employed there, you stay at the ESA for good, but in different roles. First, you're sent on your mission. Then you're assigned to various committees, for instance, not only to design spacecraft, but also to make recommendations. Then you may get a second mission. That should be possible in most cases. By this time, you're usually around 50, perhaps in your mid-50s. And then you're deployed worldwide once again to sit on committees with other astronauts and to work to promote space travel. In other words, once an astronaut, always an astronaut. In Europe, at least.
The International Space Station will remain in operation until 2024, when it will have reached its age limit. In future, researchers may possibly work on the Moon, or perhaps even fly to Mars. Whatever happens, the job profile of an astronaut will certainly change as technology advances.
There are many people capable of being astronauts. What you need to be able to do as an astronaut at any given time will gradually get easier. In the future, going into space will be as easy as flying to Mallorca is today.
And in years to come, scientists may well fly through space as passengers on their way to exploring new planets or being dropped off at their research station on the Moon. Space travelers on a mission. Astronauts.
I think being an astronaut is a fantastic job. I always say when you're a part of the European Space Agency, the best job in the European Space Agency is being an astronaut. The second best job is being the boss of the astronauts, which I also have the privilege now of being. So I'm certainly very happy. It's a great job because you work in an international environment with very motivated colleagues that are there to support you, to help you, because of course the astronauts is only the top of the iceberg. You have hundreds of people that are supporting the astronaut to be able to do his tasks on orbit, and you have really the impression that you can contribute something to society. And so for me it's an absolutely fantastic job.
Humankind now wants to go deeper into space, to probe far beyond the Earth's orbit, see new worlds with his own eyes, travel to and explore our neighbor planet Mars. Scientists and researchers are already working on the journey to Mars. And who knows, maybe one of the space agencies is already training the future Mars mission commander.
Is being an astronaut a profession worth striving for? For all those who would say, you couldn't get me up there even if you dragged me, well, obviously not. But my advice to all the others would be, definitely yes. The opportunities you have to push yourself to the limit during your training and to do science in space make it the perfect profession. But the crux of the matter is that your family has to go along with it, and that's not always the case. But if you're lucky enough to be selected, you may one day actually stand on the moon, or sometime later perhaps. even on Mars.
Humans are explorers, seekers and restless wanderers, driven by innate curiosity. Today's space travelers are the new pioneers. Their advances into space have freed mankind from gravity, the force that determines all development on Earth. This step into space was the prerequisite for discovering new worlds. As President John F. Kennedy said at the beginning of the 1960s, space is the new ocean. Up to now, humankind has only traveled along his own coast of this great ocean. The rest is still largely unexplored. But astronauts, space researchers and scientists could set out to explore entire new coasts of this ocean very soon.